You can't fight progress, old man. After 3 generations of farming, a ruthless developer had acquired every property in the valley except Henry's 50 acres. When his water supply was cut off, Henry refused to surrender before the worst flood in 50 years. 2 years later, hundreds of tractors and farm trucks rolled back into the valley, changing everything. Hi everyone, welcome to Tales Unveiled. Let's get started. Henry hated those bulldozers. Every morning they lined up at his property line like an invasion force, huge yellow monsters that had already wiped out every other farm in Willow Creek Valley. The Peterson place was gone, so was the Miller farm across the creek. Families who'd worked the land for generations had packed up and moved on, taking Wells Development's money and their history with it. But not Henry Larson. Not yet. At 72, Henry had spent his entire life on these 50 acres. His father had taught him to farm here, just like his grandfather had taught his father. 3 generations of Larsons had pulled their living from this soil. Not going to let it end with me, Henry muttered, sipping coffee that had gone cold on his porch. The letter from Wells Development sat on his kitchen table, another final offer that wasn't final at all. Each one came with more zeros, like they could put a price tag on his life's work. His daughter, Amelia, didn't understand his refusal to sell. "Dad, you could get a nice place in town," she'd said during her last call from Chicago. "Be around people. It's not healthy you being out there alone since Mom passed." But this wasn't just land to Henry, it was his last connection to Elizabeth, his wife of 50 years, who lost her battle with cancer 5 years ago. Every corner of this farm held memories of her, from the kitchen garden she tended to the oak tree where they'd carved their initials as teenagers. The sound of tires on gravel caught Henry's attention. A sleek black car was making its way up his driveway, kicking up dust as it navigated the potholes. The kind of car that cost more than Henry had made in the last decade. James Wells had come calling again. As the developer stepped out of his car, you could see why he'd made millions turning rural communities into what he called lifestyle destinations. Tailored suit despite the summer heat, not a single silver hair out of place, the kind of confidence that came from never hearing no. Henry didn't stand when Wells climbed the porch steps, didn't take the hand Wells offered. "Beautiful morning, Mr. Larson," Wells said with practiced charm. "Mind if I join you?" "Still my porch," Henry replied, "for now anyway." Wells took a seat in the chair next to Henry's, setting a leather folder between them. If he was bothered by Henry's cold reception, he didn't show it. "I've been thinking about our situation, Mr. Larson," Wells began, "and I believe I've found a solution that works for both of us." Henry just kept rocking, eyes fixed on his cornfield. "The stalks were coming in strong this year. 50% above my last offer," Wells continued, pulling out papers. "That's 3 times what this property would normally sell for. More than enough to buy a comparable farm elsewhere, or a very comfortable retirement." When Henry didn't respond, Wells kept going, his voice had the smooth, practiced quality of a man who closed deals for a living. "The county commissioners have already approved the zoning changes. Infrastructure planning is complete. We break ground on the east section next week." Still Henry rocked, silent. Wells' perfect smile slipped just slightly. "Mr. Larson, I'm trying to be fair here, but Willow Creek Estates is happening with or without your 50 acres. That finally got Henry to look at him. "Then I reckon you'll be moving forward without them." Wells sighed and leaned forward. "I was hoping to avoid mentioning this, but the creek diversion we've implemented for flood control will significantly impact your irrigation access. And the new access road won't connect to your current driveway." There it was, the threat hiding behind all that politeness. "You cutting off my water and road access, Mr. Wells?" "I'm simply explaining the reality of the approved development plan." Wells kept his voice neutral, but his eyes were cold now. "The county has signed off on everything. I'm offering you a way out before things become difficult." Henry stood up, ignoring the protest in his knees. "My daddy farmed this land during the Dust Bowl. My granddaddy survived locust swarms that blackened the sky. I reckon I can handle whatever difficulties you throw my way." Wells gathered his papers, tucking them back into the folder. His smile returned, but it didn't reach his eyes anymore. "The offer stands for 1 more week, Mr. Larson. After that, we move forward with the approved plans." He held out a business card. "Call me when you're ready to be reasonable. For you, a free like is easy. But for me, it is the greatest support and encouragement. For this video, can you give me 1 like and 1 subscription? Thank you very much." Henry ignored the card. "I know where to find you if I change my mind." Wells nodded once, then headed back to his car. Before getting in, he turned back to Henry. "Your daughter, Amelia, is it? She mentioned you might be interested in a place in Riverdale." The fact that Wells had contacted Amelia sent a jolt through Henry. "You leave my daughter out of this." Wells just shrugged. "Just trying to accommodate family wishes." He slid into his car, the engine purring to life. 1 week, Mr. Larson. Then things changed. As the black car disappeared down the driveway, Henry felt suddenly alone. Amelia wanted him to sell. The town probably did too. New development meant jobs, tax revenue, progress. Nobody seemed to care about what was being lost in the process. That evening, as Henry checked his irrigation lines, he noticed the creek was already running lower than it should be this time of year. Wells wasn't waiting for the wheat to be up. The pressure had already begun. "Not going to work," Henry muttered, patting a fence post his father had set in the ground decades ago. "This land has survived worse than you, James Wells." What Henry didn't know was that in less than 24 hours, everything would change. Not with signatures on a contract, but with a storm that neither man could have predicted. The rain started just after midnight. Not a gentle summer shower, but a pounding deluge that hammered against the farmhouse roof like someone was throwing rocks. Henry awoke immediately. A lifetime of farming had made him alert to any change in weather. By dawn, he knew this was going to be bad. Really bad. The creek that had been nearly dry yesterday was now a raging torrent, well beyond its banks. Through sheets of rain, Henry could see the water rushing across the newly graded terrain of Wells' development. The fancy drainage system they'd installed was completely overwhelmed. Nature, it seemed, had its own plans for Willow Creek Valley. Henry's phone had lost service overnight, and the power had gone out around 4 a.m. He'd fired up the old generator, enough to keep his refrigerator running and provide a few lights. The farmhouse sat on a slight rise, the highest point in the immediate area, which had kept it safe from flooding in the past. Around mid-morning, as Henry was checking on his livestock in the barn, he heard something. A faint cry carried on the wind and rain. He paused, listening. There it was again, definitely human, coming from the direction of his eastern property line. Grabbing his rain slicker and a length of rope, Henry trudged through the muddy yard toward the sound. The visibility was terrible, but as he reached the edge of his property, he could make out a figure struggling through what had been the Peterson place just a month ago. The person was waist-deep in rushing water, fighting to stay upright against the current. As Henry got closer, he almost stopped in his tracks. It was James Wells. The developer was barely recognizable, his expensive suit ruined, his perfect hair plastered to his head, a gash across his forehead bleeding freely. He looked nothing like the confident businessman who had sat on Henry's porch the day before. "Larson!" Wells called out, his voice barely audible above the storm. "Help me." Henry didn't hesitate. He secured one end of the rope to a sturdy fence post and waded in. The water was shockingly cold, its pull stronger than he'd expected. It took all his strength to forge a path toward the stranded man. "Grab hold!" Henry shouted when he reached Wells, looping the rope around the developer's waist. "I've got you." Together they fought their way back through the churning water. By the time they reached dry ground, both men were gasping for breath, soaked to the bone, and shivering in the wind. "My car!" Wells managed between chattering teeth. Flash flood. Swept off the road. "Can't worry about your car now," Henry said, helping Wells toward the farmhouse. "Let's get you inside before you freeze to death." By the time they reached the house, Wells was barely able to walk, his lips turning an alarming shade of blue. Whatever differences existed between them, Henry couldn't let the man die from exposure. "Get those wet clothes off," Henry ordered, tossing a towel and some of his own flannel and denim toward Wells. "Bathroom's down the hall. There's a first aid kit under the sink for that cut." Wells nodded weakly, teeth chattering too hard to speak. While Wells changed, Henry built a fire in the hearth and put coffee on the stove. Outside, the storm intensified, wind now joining the relentless rain, howling around the old farmhouse. When Wells emerged from the bathroom, he looked like a different person. Dressed in Henry's too large clothes, the gash on his forehead crudely bandaged, he had none of the polished confidence he'd shown yesterday. He stood uncertainly in the doorway of the living room. "Sit before you fall over," Henry said, nodding toward the armchair nearest the fire. "Coffee is almost ready." Wells sank into the chair gratefully. "My car got caught in a flash flood about a mile from here," he explained, his voice still shaky. "I tried to make it to one of our construction trailers, but it was already gone. Your lights were the only ones I could see." Henry handed him a steaming mug. "Phone working?" Wells shook his head. "Dead roads are probably washed out all the way to town," Henry said, settling into his own chair. "Looks like we're stuck with each other until this passes." An uncomfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling fire and the storm's continued assault. Finally, Wells spoke. "I didn't think it would flood like this." "The environmental reports told you what you wanted to hear," Henry interrupted. "Nature has its own way of doing things. Creek's been flooding that low ground every few years since before my grandfather's time. That's why it was pasture, not cropland." Wells stared into his coffee. "The engineers assured me the drainage system." "Can't beat God's design, Mr. Wells. That creek wants to flow where it's always flowed." For the first time since Henry had known him, James Wells had no ready response. As the day wore on, it became clear they were truly stranded. The flood waters had completely surrounded the farmhouse, turning it into an island in a newly formed lake. Henry's generator provided enough power for essentials, and his pantry was well stocked. Rural living had taught him to always be prepared for isolation. They ate a simple dinner of canned stew warmed on the wood stove, the silence between them gradually becoming less hostile and more contemplative. Henry noticed that Wells kept glancing at the family photos on the mantel. "Your family?" Wells finally asked, nodding toward a faded photo of a young Henry with his arm around a smiling woman standing in front of a much newer-looking barn. "My Elizabeth," Henry answered. "Taken the year after we married, when we took over the farm from my parents." Wells studied the photo. "You built this place together." It wasn't a question, but Henry nodded anyway. "Everything you see. The extensions to the house, the new barn, the irrigation system." Elizabeth was better with figures than I ever was. She handled the books, told me where we could afford to expand, when to hold back. She's gone 5 years now. "Cancer." Henry's voice grew softer. "Fought it like she fought everything, head on, no complaints." Wells was quiet for a moment. "My mother died of cancer when I was 11. Leukemia." Henry looked at Wells with new interest. "I'm sorry to hear that." "My father couldn't keep the farm going without her," Wells continued, the words seeming to surprise even him. "Bank took it a year later." Henry sat up straighter. "You grew up on a farm?" A shadow passed over Wells's face. 80 acres in western Minnesota. "Nothing like this place. Barely keeping afloat even in good years." He gestured vaguely. "My father wasn't much of a businessman. Or much of a father after she died." The revelation shifted something in the air between them. Not friendship, not yet, but perhaps a crack in the wall of animosity. "What happened after you lost the farm?" Henry found himself asking. Wells stared into the fire. "Foster care. 4 different homes in 6 years. Last one was in Minneapolis, a couple who owned real estate. The husband would take me along sometimes when he was looking at properties." His expression softened slightly at the memory. "First time I'd seen anyone make money from land without breaking their back over it." Henry could see it now, the boy who'd lost everything, who'd watched his family's land slip away, vowing never to be at the mercy of such forces again, who'd found another way to control the land. To bend it to his will through contracts and bulldozers rather than plows and sweat. Is that why you became a developer? To control what once controlled you? Wells looked startled by the insight. I became a developer to build things that last, he said, but the certainty in his voice wavered. To create value where others couldn't. And the farms you bulldoze? The families who worked that land for generations? What about their value? Instead of the defensive response Henry expected, Wells looked out the window at the rain-lashed darkness, at the flood that had swallowed his carefully engineered development. Progress has casualties, he said quietly, but the words sounded rehearsed, as if he told himself this many times before. So did the bank when they took your family's farm, Henry observed. Wells fell silent, and neither man spoke again until it was time to turn in for the night. For you, a free like is easy. But for me, it is the greatest support and encouragement. For this video, can you give me 1 like and 1 subscription? Thank you very much. The second day of the storm brought no improvement in conditions. The floodwaters had risen further, now lapping at the bottom porch step. Henry's generator continued its steady hum, but he was carefully rationing fuel. They still had no phone service, no way to know when help might come. To Henry's surprise, Wells asked if he could help with the morning chores. Together they checked on the livestock in the barn, Wells awkwardly following Henry's instructions on feeding the animals. His expensive leather shoes, the only footwear he had, were soon caked with mud and straw. You actually enjoy this, don't you? Wells asked as they carried buckets of water to the stalls. The physical work, I mean. Henry considered the question. There's satisfaction in it, he said finally. Your labor, keeping things alive and healthy. Wells nodded thoughtfully. I used to help my father with the milking. Hated getting up before dawn, but I liked the quiet time with him. Something like wistfulness crossed his face. After my mother died, those quiet mornings were about the only time he seemed present throughout the day. As they worked together to secure what they could against the storm, Henry began to see glimpses of a different James Wells, not the ruthless developer, but a man whose sharp edges had been shaped by loss and determination. Not so different perhaps from Henry's own stubborn resilience. That evening, as they sat by the fire eating the simple meal Henry had prepared, Wells broke their comfortable silence. Why won't you sell, Henry? The question was asked not with frustration, but with genuine curiosity. Really? Is it just the family history? Henry took his time answering, weighing his words carefully. Partly. But it's more than that. He gestured toward the window where darkness had once again fallen. This land knows me. Knows my footsteps, my touch. I've put my sweat, my blood into every acre, year after year, planting, harvesting, enduring. He leaned forward, eyes intent on Wells. Have you ever owned something you couldn't bear to part with? Not for any price. Something that was part of your very soul? Wells was quiet for a long moment. I had my mother's wedding ring, he said finally. Simple thing, not worth much. I carried it through every foster home, hidden in different places so it wouldn't get stolen. He stared into his coffee, lost in the memory. Lost it when I was 19, moving into my first apartment. Tore the place apart looking for it, but it was gone. How did that feel? Henry asked gently. Like losing her all over again. Wells's voice was barely audible, like the last piece of home was gone. That's what selling this farm would be for me, Henry said gently. Like losing everything all over again. Wells looked around the simple farmhouse, his eyes lingering on the marks on the kitchen door frame showing Amelia's height through the years, the worn spot on the couch where Elizabeth used to sit. The collection of smooth stones on the windowsill that Henry and his wife had gathered on their walks. It's not just a property to you, he said slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. It's the physical embodiment of your life's story. Henry nodded, surprised and somewhat moved that Wells had grasped what so many others, including his own daughter, had not. But what happens when you're gone, Henry? Wells asked, not unkindly. Will Amelia keep the farm going? It was the question that kept Henry awake on many nights. Amelia has her life in Chicago. Her career, her family. She's not coming back to farm. He sighed heavily. I don't have an answer for that. I just know I can't be the one to end it. To be the Larson who gave up what my grandfather and father fought so hard to build and keep. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the farmhouse, something had shifted. Two men from different worlds had begun to see each other, not as obstacles or enemies, but as people shaped by love and loss, trying to honor their pasts while securing their futures. On the morning of the third day, they woke to silence. The rain had stopped. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The flood waters had begun to recede, though the damage was extensive. From the porch, they surveyed the transformed landscape. My God, Wells breathed, taking in the scene where his carefully planned development had stood. There was devastation. Half-built structures lay collapsed or tilted at odd angles. Construction equipment sat partially submerged in muddy water. The drainage system that was supposed to control the creek had been completely overwhelmed, with chunks of concrete pipe exposed where the rushing water had torn away the earth covering them. But on Henry's land, the damage was minimal. The natural contours of the property, shaped by generations of careful stewardship, had channeled the water away from the most vulnerable areas. The house and barn stood unharmed on their slight rise. Even the fields, though temporarily flooded in places, would recover quickly once the water receded. Your land weathered it, Wells said quietly. Mine didn't. Henry didn't respond. There was no need to point out what was plainly visible, that nature had rendered its verdict on Wells' vision for Willow Creek Valley. They heard vehicles approaching before they saw them, the rumble of heavy engines navigating the damaged road. A county sheriff's truck appeared first, followed by a search and rescue vehicle. Looks like civilization has found us, Henry remarked. Wells nodded, a complex expression crossing his face. I suppose I should call my office, assess the damage, start planning rebuilding efforts. But he didn't move toward the approaching vehicles. Instead, he turned to Henry. Thank you, he said simply. You could have left me out there. No, Henry replied. I couldn't have. The rescue workers were surprised to find the two men together, the developer Ray. The holdout farmer calmly sharing coffee on the porch while surveying the devastation. They were even more surprised when Wells declined immediate evacuation, saying he had some business to finish with Mr. Larson first. After the sheriff assured them that road access would be restored by evening, the vehicles departed, leaving Henry and Wells alone once more. I had a lot of time to think these past 3 days, Wells said, staring out at the flooded valley, about what you said. About the land, about history, about what we leave behind. Henry waited, sensing Wells had more to say. My development plans are. Wells gestured toward the devastation. Well, they clearly need rethinking. The environmental surveys were wrong. The engineering was inadequate. He turned to Henry, his expression earnest. I'd like to propose something different. A partnership. Henry raised an eyebrow, skeptical but listening. What if, Wells continued, instead of trying to erase what this valley has always been, we worked with it? Created something that honors its agricultural heritage while still providing growth for the community? What exactly are you suggesting? A different kind of development. One that preserves your farm as a working educational center, community gardens surrounding it, a farmer's market as the commercial hub instead of more chain stores, housing that respects the natural landscape rather than reshaping it. Henry studied Wells, looking for signs of manipulation or insincerity. He found none. And what would I need to do for this grand vision? Teach, Wells said simply. Share your knowledge. Help a new generation understand what you know about this land. He paused. And when the time comes, know that your legacy will continue, not be buried under concrete. It was more than Henry had dared hope for. Not just a reprieve for his own lifetime, but a future for the farm that honored what it had always been. Why would you do this? Henry asked. It's a complete reversal of everything you've planned. Wells looked out at the creek, now receding back into its natural channel, the path it had followed for centuries before man tried to redirect it. Because you were right, and I was wrong, he said, the admission clearly difficult for him, about the land, about what has value. He met Henry's gaze directly. And because these 3 days reminded me of who I was before I became. He gestured at himself, at the incongruous sight of James Wells in borrowed flannel and mud-caked shoes. This. And who was that? Henry asked. A farm boy who loved the land before he learned to fear losing it. That evening, as county workers cleared the road enough for Wells to leave, the two men stood on Henry's porch one last time. Wells had changed back into his ruined suit, somehow looking more authentic in the mud-stained fabric than he ever had in its pristine state. "I'll have new proposals drawn up within the week," Wells said, extending his hand. Henry took it, the handshake firm between them. "I'll believe it when I see the bulldozers pull back." Wells smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Fair enough. For you, a free like is easy. But for me, it is the greatest support and encouragement. For this video, can you give me 1 like and 1 subscription? Thank you very much." True to his word, James Wells transformed his vision for Willow Creek Valley. The bulldozers did stop at Henry's property line, permanently. In their place came architects specializing in sustainable development, agricultural experts, and community planners. 2 years later, the day arrived for the official opening of Willow Creek Community. Henry stood beside James Wells near a simple wooden stage that had been set up at the edge of his cornfield. A small crowd had gathered, mostly county officials, investors, and a few reporters. A nervous Wells asked, adjusting his tie. He still wore suits, but these days they were paired with sturdy boots that could handle the farm's terrain. "Just hope people understand what we're trying to do here." "Nope," Henry replied, though he was. The development surrounding Henry's farm was unlike anything Wells had built before. Instead of cookie-cutter houses, unique homes designed to work with the natural landscape stood along curving roads that followed the contours of the land. The old Peterson dairy barn had been carefully restored as a farmer's market. The creek followed its natural course, with parks and walking trails along its banks. Amelia had returned from Chicago for the event with Henry's grandchildren. As Wells prepared to address the small gathering, Henry noticed something strange in the distance. A plume of dust was rising from the county road. "We expecting more people?" Henry asked, squinting against the sun. Wells followed his gaze. "Not that I know of." The rumble of engines grew louder. Coming up the road was a procession of vehicles, not the shiny SUVs of potential home buyers, but tractors, pickup trucks, old farm vehicles, some looking like they'd been pulled from barns where they'd sat for years. "What in the world?" Wells murmured. The vehicles kept coming, lining up along the road, then parking wherever they could find space. People spilled out, families with children, elderly couples, men and women in work clothes and Sunday best. Henry recognized many of their faces. The Peterson family, who had sold their dairy farm. The Millers. The Johnsons. Farmers who had taken Wells' money and moved away. People who had lost their land to progress. And they were coming back. Henry called to a familiar voice. John Peterson, 83 years old and supposedly retired to Florida, was making his way through the crowd. "Thought I'd never set foot in this valley again." "John, what are you doing here?" Henry asked, stunned. "Word got around," the old man said with a smile, "about what you did. About how you stood your ground. About how this developer fella saw the light." He gestured toward the fields. "Never thought I'd see the day when someone like him would understand what this land means." More people approached. Farmers, shopkeepers from town, families who had lived in the valley for generations. Are those signs?" Wells asked, pointing. Children were carrying handmade posters. "Henry Larson's land lives on. Willow Creek lives again. Thank you for saving our valley." A young woman approached with a basket. "Mr. Larson, I'm Katie Miller. My grandfather's farm used to be across the creek. These are seeds from his last harvest before we sold. We thought maybe they could be planted in the community garden." Henry took the basket, a lump forming in his throat. "I'd be honored." Wells stood in silent amazement as more people arrived. Someone had brought old photographs of the valley as it once was. Someone else had a quilt made from scraps of work clothes from all the old farming families. "Did you know about this?" Wells asked Henry. Henry shook his head, watching as people began migrating toward the community garden plots that had been established near his barn. Children were already digging in the soil, guided by grandparents who taught them how to plant properly. An impromptu celebration was forming. Tables appeared, food was laid out, someone started playing a fiddle. The official opening ceremony was forgotten as something more authentic took its place. "I never understood," Wells said quietly, watching the scene unfold. "When I was buying up these farms, I thought I was just acquiring land, property. I never saw." He gestured at the gathering. Henry nodded. "This is what I couldn't put into words that night during the flood. This is what I was trying not to lose. Not just your farm," Wells realized. "A way of life. A community. My part of it anyway," Henry said later as the sun began to set over Willow Creek Valley. Henry found himself sitting on a hay bale beside old John Peterson, watching children play tag between rows of newly planted vegetables. "Never thought I'd say this," John remarked, "but that developer of yours did all right in the end." Henry watched as Wells moved through the crowd, listening more than talking, learning the stories of people whose land he had once seen only as future building sites. He remembered who he was, Henry said simply. Amelia sat down beside her father, slipping her arm through his. "Dad, I owe you an apology. All this time, I thought you were just being stubborn about the farm." "I was," Henry replied with a smile, "but sometimes being stubborn is the only way to make sure people stop long enough to see what matters." As twilight settled over the valley, tractor headlights and lanterns created pools of golden light throughout the gathering. Someone had brought out an old CB radio, and the crackling voices of farmers checking in from miles away filled the air. The modern homes of Willow Creek community stood in the background, their lights coming on one by one as darkness fell. But it was the old ways that took center stage tonight. Henry made his way to his porch, needing a moment alone. The valley spread out before him, changed yet somehow more itself than ever. His land was still his, but now it was something more, a bridge between past and future, a seed from which something new but respectful could grow. He felt a presence beside him and turned to find Wells. "I never thought I'd say this," Wells admitted, "but thank you for not selling to me." Henry chuckled. "The flood did most of the convincing." "No," Wells shook his head. "It was you. Seeing someone who valued something so much they couldn't put a price on it. It made me remember when I felt that way too." He looked out at the lights scattered across the valley. "You know, my mother used to say that the measure of a man isn't what he builds, but what he chooses to preserve." Henry nodded, thinking of Elizabeth, of what she would have made of all this. Wise woman. She would have liked you. From below, a child's voice called out, "Mr. Larson, we need you to show us where to plant the pumpkins." Henry smiled. "Duty calls." As he made his way back down to the gathering, Henry felt a profound sense of peace. The bulldozers had stopped at his property line, yes, but what had grown in their place was something neither he nor Wells could have envisioned alone, not just a development, not just a farm, but a community with roots as deep as the oldest oak in the valley. As the sun dipped below the horizon, tractors and trucks lined the old county road, their headlights illuminating the path home for families who had once thought this land lost to them forever. They had come not with protest signs, but with seeds, stories, and withered hands, ready to reconnect. As Henry watched the fireflies rise above his fields, a warmth spread through his chest. Not just pride in his stand, but the fierce, unexpected joy of knowing the land would live on through all of them. Sometimes, the most important boundaries aren't the ones that divide us, but the ones that remind us what truly matters, and when those boundaries should be crossed. Love this story? Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more. Don't forget to check out the video currently on your screen, you won't want to miss it. See you in the next one.